All right, pivoting a little bit. A lot of people ask, okay, are these people just with like they're schizophrenic? How do you know there's really a demon there? Obviously, if a person's, cursing you out in ancient Greek or Latin or Hebrew, that's a pretty good sign. Maybe you could talk about demons speaking languages. You have a section on that in the book. But also, what's the process to discern? Is this person uh, having a psychological fit, or is there actual personality, a demon present in this person? So, how do you know?
Well, there are. I do go into, especially in the clergy version. In the lay people, I removed a lot of that because the section in possession, I think in the lay version it was 86 pages, and then in the clergy version it's 178 pages long, just a section on possession. And a lot of that is because I'm going into the diagnostics. How do you determine one way or another what the patterns are? We have what we call primary signs and secondary signs. So the primary signs are those things which human beings are incapable of doing. And there's essentially three of them. The first is speaking languages they don't know. So, and this is not, you see this from time to time. Sometimes exorcists will mistakenly think, especially when they're first starting out as an exorcist, that, well, if I speak to you in Latin and the demon, and if you're possessed, and you should be able to talk to me in Latin. That's not necessarily how it works, because Christ actually does restrict the demons on what languages they can use, how much they can use of it, etc. So you'll get people who are clearly possessed because there's other preternatural signs, but they only will speak to you in English. I jokingly tell people that I actually had one demon would only speak in Latin. So whenever I would use, for example, if my grammar wasn't perfect, so if I used the dative or the accusative when I should have used the ablative or something in some declension or something like that, he would just act like he didn't have to pay any attention to me, right? So, and I thought at one point I wanted to say to him, you're a little uppity for a guy who's taken a beating, but.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point being is that they're able to speak languages that they've never studied or that they do not know. Once in a while, you'll get these psychologists who come up with this theory, which was kind of in vogue for a while, which was, oh, well, maybe they heard the language sometime in the past. Well, that violates the principle of sufficient reason, because no human being can hear part of a language and then all of a sudden be perfectly fluent in the language.
I wish.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was really surprised they weren't called on the carpet just from the silliness of that proposition. So speaking languages they don't know. And then the other one is occult knowledge. This comes in two forms. The first form is that they actually know particulars, so it's about particular knowledge about you or some events, sometimes at a distance, about what's actually going on, even though they're not there, or they can't see it, or they've never met the person, or what have you. That's not too common. You do see that from time to time where they actually know what's going on. One case I actually worked on, that was actually the form of the preternatural sign that we knew that this person was possessed, because I gave the demon a purely mental command. I didn't say anything. I was very specific about what he had to do and how he had to obey me. And as soon as I mentally gave him the command, he immediately executed it exactly as I had told him to do. So, and then as time went on, we started finding all sorts of other forms of occult knowledge. The other form is people who have, you'll see they'll have knowledge of the sciences, both philosophical, theological, and even empirical, but they'll have knowledge of the sciences that the person's never studied or that's beyond their capability. So I had one case where this demon was making all sorts of theological distinctions that, unless you're like on your or my level, they are not going to know these distinctions. They just aren't going to know these. Unless you're extraordinarily well-read in certain areas, you're just not going to know those. And yet he was just talking about them like they were everyday kinds of things. And this was far beyond the woman's capacity. And then the last category is kind of a catch-all category, which is those things that are beyond human capacity. So things like superhuman strength. The one that we see the most often is what we call morphing, which they change shape. And that's the one that you tend to see most of the time. And these are not just, people making faces. This is structural changes and things looking like, people changing into animals and things of that sort. But it all...
What about heads spinning around?
I've never seen any of that kind of thing. I mean, they do things that are physically, they appear to be physically impossible, right? Like certain kinds of contortions and things like that. And it's like, yeah, that's not human, right? But sometimes people, they'll say, well, if you're levitating, then that's a sign of possession. And that's not actually true. Levitation is one of those things that you can have levitation if you're in a building that's possessed and the person's being drug around the room or they're levitated in the room. So that it can be a sign of the building's possessed. It can also be a sign of sanctity, which we saw with St. John Cafaso, right? It can be it can also be, but it can be a sign of possession, but it has to go with other signs because there's other possibilities in relationship to why possessed. So there's a whole variety of different things. I actually go in the priest version. I go into I think 57 different versions of that. So that's the primary signs. Then we have what we call secondary signs, and those are things that are ancillary to the particular case. So it's not the primary signs, but the demons will do certain things, like externally, things will be happening consistently. So, for example, virtually everybody who is possessed suffers from diabolical oppression, where their finances are destroyed, or their relationships are a problem, or their family life is just a disaster, what have you. It can also be obsession, which is that psychological patterns. I also talk about how you discern between possession, psychological patterns, and say someone who's just schizophrenic, because there is a distinction. It's a very, if you know what you're looking at, it's pretty clear. But if you don't, you're going to have a hard time discerning it. I'll just give you one example. So somebody who's possessed, unless they're perfectly possessed, are going to go through periods of lucidity, which means the demon's going to manifest for a while and be out of control for a while, and then he's just going to stop, and then the person will go back to normal. And so when you see that switching on and switching off, and there's no external stimulus that's causing the thing, there's no indicator of why this should actually be the case, etc., that is a sign that it's diabolic. Whereas if it's psychological, it's going to be either from an organic cause, which is consistent, or it's going to be from a set of intellectual habits, which is consistent. So you're going to see stuff, and it's going to respond to external stimuli and things like that. And so that's one of the signs that you can kind of get an indicator of that, okay, this is probably more diabolic than it is psychological. Sometimes, too, you see this with dissociative identity disorder. That's one of the reasons I go into it. We do come across those cases, and it can look like possession to the uninitiate. But if you know what the indicators actually are between the two of them, it's very simple to, in fact, one of the last cases that I looked at for another exorcist, he had me look at the case, and I just did a few things and discussed. I was probably not even there 15 minutes. And then I just kind of slowed everything down, de-escalated everything, talked to the exorcist afterwards, and I said, this isn't a case of possession, this is a case of DID, and then I showed them, here's the criteria and here's why. So for the clergy, they would actually be able to get that. So there are very clear indicators. This is one of the reasons in the writing of the book, before that I had written that book on Introduction to Psychology, Introduction to the Science of Mental Health. But I spent 15 years literally watching the psychological patterns, watching the diabolic patterns, what the differences were, how they were easily to discern. And so that's what's kind of integrated into the book. So we have secondary signs. And a lot of times you can just look at the secondary signs and say it's probably possession, and then you can do certain things to bring the demon to the surface. Whereas if you realize, no, this is not it, this is more psychological, then you can get people help in that regard.
Mm-hmm.